Okay, good. Now we're recording. Okay, thank you for joining us for the second of our three-part virtual audio described Missouri Botanical Gardens series. I think everybody knows me that's on this call, but my name is Megan Harms, and I'm the Arts and Culture Coordinator at MindsEye. And this event was made possible with funding in part from the Arts and Education Council. And we will be sending out a survey after the third week, but it never hurts to remind everyone before the third week that we'll be sending out the survey, just to put it in the back of your mind, because it's really important for our funders to learn what we do and how we make a difference. So every survey answer is helpful for us. Also, before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that MindsEye is located in Belleville, Illinois, the ancestral lands of many people, including the tribes commonly known as the Sioux, Quapaw, Miamia, Osage, Kaskaskia, and Kickapoo. We also acknowledge those tribes who pass near our area during their forced removal, including the Cherokee, Delaware, Sac and Fox, and Shawnee. And the process of knowing and acknowledging the ground beneath our feet is a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the people on this land before us. And thanks again, everybody, for being here. First, I just want to give a quick hello to our special guest, Carol Gravens. Hi, Carol.
Hi, Megan, and hi, everyone.
And we're going to learn more about Carol in just a minute. And also April. Say hello, April.
Hello, everyone.
April is our audio describer. So just a reminder of what we're going to do. First, we'll watch the audio described video, and you'll hear the voice of the host, Babs. She's in the video, and you'll also hear April's voice. And then this video this week is about 15 minutes long, so it's a few minutes longer than last week. And then we'll turn it over to Q&A with Carol. So I am going to start my screen share now. First, I'm going to turn off my video so you don't have to see me while the video is big. And let me know if you have any problems.
Hi, I'm Babs Wagner.
I'm going to turn the volume up a little bit before we start.
Hi, I'm Babs Wagner, and I'm the orchid grower here at the garden, and I've been here now for over 25 years, taking care of this incredible collection. Our collection is actually grown in 3 different greenhouses, 3 climate-controlled greenhouses, cool, intermediate, and warm, and we have orchids from all over the world in these greenhouses. Historically, the collection dates all the way back to the 1800s, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in the meantime, I just want to show you some bits and pieces, some of the highlights of our collection that are blooming, and maybe some that aren't even in bloom yet.
Audio description for the orchid collection hosted by Babs Wagner is provided by MindsEye. Babs stands in the center of a sea of potted plants of extraordinary height.
What you see on this bench behind me are orchids from the genus Angraecum. And the Angraecum are a really specialized group of orchids from Madagascar. This orchid right next to me is commonly referred to as Darwin's Orchid. And the reason it's called Darwin's Orchid is because Darwin actually describes the pollinator for this species, which is Angraecum sesquipedale. He describes it in his book, Origin of Species, and he talks about a moth that had to have had a really long proboscis in order to pollinate the flower. That moth hadn't been discovered when he described the orchid, and shortly after his description, lo and behold, the moth was discovered. So ever since then, it's always been known as Darwin's Orchid. These are all pollinated by moths. They're fragrant at night. It's really a delight to come in here early on a morning and smell the Angraecums in bloom. These that you see here now, most of them have been in bloom now since early November. So they last a really long time. And they all have a characteristic spur. And the moth has to get its proboscis down to the bottom of that spur in order to pollinate the flower.
Green dorsal fin-shaped leaves frame an ivory star-shaped waxy blossom.
I'm standing in front of vanilla Planafolia. A lot of people don't realize that vanilla comes from an orchid. The garden is proud to have about 16 different species of vanilla. And they usually bloom for us in summer and winter. And in the wild, they are vines, and they will vine 70, 80 feet up into a tree canopy, and it's when they go back down, when gravity takes them down, that is when they start to flower. Flowers only last one day, but you'll have sequential blooming. So the bloom period will go on for a while. They all have to be pollinated by hand because the bee that pollinates them is not native to where they grow naturally. And the whole process of pollinating, the ripening pods, harvesting, curing is really lengthy. And so that gives you an idea of why vanilla is so expensive.
She uses the pointy tip of a dental floss pick to massage the center of a yellow orchid.
Behind me is Chromatophilum speciosum. This orchid is one of the largest orchids in the world. They can grow up to the size of a ton, a small elephant, if you will. The one behind me, you can see how large it is. This was acquired by the garden in 1989, and I have yet to see it flower. Apparently they have to get really, really big in order to flower.
Large, wispy green leaves with intertwined tentacle branches sway.
Orchids are either epiphytic or they're terrestrial. Epiphytic orchids grow in trees or on branches or on tree trunks. Terrestrial orchids grow in the ground. What we have here are some epiphytic orchids that don't grow well in pots, and so we mount them on pieces of cork. Cork is a renewable resource. The cork tree will regrow its bark, its cork bark, in 7 years, and they can strip the tree from it with its bark for 7 times, and then they have to stop, and then it becomes detrimental to the tree. But the reason we like to use it to mount orchids is because the epiphytic roots love to cling to the cork because of the nooks and crannies. And so that is why we mount orchids on cork. This particular orchid, Brassavola nodosa, has a wonderful nickname of Lady of the Night, and that's because it's phototropic, meaning that it is only fragrant when it's dark. So if you have this orchid growing in your home and you have it in a dark room, you can walk into that room and it will be just incredibly fragrant. But the minute you turn the light on, that fragrance will dissipate. Hence the Lady of the Night.
A white lattice wall of varying orchids.
We are now in what we call the intermediate house of the orchid collection. This is our largest greenhouse, and we came out of the warm house, so we're kind of going down in temperature. So most of the orchids in this house are native to Central and South America. In 1876, Mrs. Henry Blow gave the founder of the garden, Henry Shaw, his very first orchids. And he liked them so much that that was the beginning of the whole orchid collection. Then in the early 1920s, George Pring was sent to Colombia, and he came back with over 5,000 cattleyas. So that was what kick-started the entire orchid collection. And in 1924, they had their very first orchid show. So cattleyas, as you can see from these large white flowers, are very showy. And so they are probably the predominant orchid of our display of orchids throughout the garden when we do display orchids. Right now, the orchids are displayed in the climatron, and we change them out every week. And they also have some divisions of our species tied into the trees and on branches and tree trunks in the climatron, which can give you an idea of how they would grow naturally in the wild. Generally, cattleyas are very fragrant, but they're not all fragrant at the same time. It all depends on the genetic makeup of the plant.
In a greenhouse, a row of potted orchids adorn 4 shelves on each side with the center row hanging from the ceiling.
This is Ancelia africa, native to Africa. It's considered an endangered orchid in the wild. Here at the garden, we've been doing a lot of conservation with orchids and trying to target orchids that are rare or endangered in the wild. So when we acquire an endangered orchid, of course by legal means, not by collecting, all of our orchids are given a zinc, which is what I'm holding in my hand here. And the black zincs, which are metal tags, indicate that the plant is rare and endangered. We have an extensive record-keeping system here at the garden, and all our plants throughout the garden are entered in our Living Collections Management System database. Here in the orchid collection and in other areas of the garden, we put barcodes on our zincs, and if you zoom in and you have a barcode reader, it'll give you all the information you need to know about that particular orchid. When it was acquired, how long we've had the plant, how many we have, and it's a valuable tool, particularly for me when I go to repot or divide an orchid.
Red leopard spots adorn an array of yellow orchids with small finger-like leaves.
What I'm holding here is a Catasetum hybrid. Catasetum is a genus that grows in Central and South America, and in its native habitat, it goes dormant. So when we're trying to grow it in cultivation, we have to simulate that dormancy. So starting in about late October, early November, I gradually decrease watering until I stop altogether. And the plant, which used to have many strapping leaves on it, gradually drops all its leaves, and sometimes it blooms after the leaves have dropped. This plant is interesting in that in order to be pollinated, the insect has to climb inside the flower, and it hits the pollen, and the pollen winds up being jetted out of the flower, and then the plant is pollinated.
Pots of ivory orchids with thick gray-green stems reveal new orchids.
We've now moved into the cool orchid house. This greenhouse houses orchids primarily from Australia, New Zealand, cloud forest orchids, orchids growing at higher elevations. What you see here around me are Paphiopedilum or lady slipper orchids. These are faithful bloomers. They bloom once a year, every year. They've been in the collection since 1918. Back in 1915 and 1918, D.S. Brown, who lived in Kirkwood, donated his entire collection of orchids, which his collection was famous and known around the world. And he donated his collection, many of which were these Paphiopedilums that you see here.
Black and white photo. A man in a suit and bow tie sits on a bench in a greenhouse gazing at a row of orchids.
Most people are used to seeing orchids growing in pots or, as I showed you earlier, mounted on pieces of cork. But another way to display orchids is to tie them onto branches of Osage orange, which is what you see here. This particular branch was just done 2 years ago. And it gives you an idea of how orchids would grow naturally in the wild. Osage orange is a really, really hard wood, especially after it's dried and cured. And when we mount orchids on it, we can usually leave those orchids on there for probably anywhere from 6 to 8 years before the wood will start to rot. It also has wonderful little fissures in the bark that the roots like to crawl into and attach to. So when we initially put the orchids on there, we tie them on with fishing line. So you really can't see the attachment at all, and eventually the orchid will grow over it. This particular plant, this branch has about 20 individual plants tied onto it. And eventually, probably within the next 2 years, they will all just grow together and it'll look like it's one continuous plant.
A single piece of yellow tape with red dots tied around a statuesque orchid pod.
This is something most people don't get to see unless they're actually here like you are with me in the orchid range. This goofy looking tape is marking some seed pods. This is a Calanthe terrestrial orchid that we decided we would like to have more of it, and so our micro-propagator, Caleb, pollinated it for me, self-pollinated it when it was in bloom, and now we're waiting for the seeds to ripen. We're really excited to be starting up a new laboratory so that we can once again do micropropagation, tissue culture, and various other means of propagation like we used to do many, many years ago here at the garden with the orchid collection and other collections throughout. So hopefully we will have more. We're trying to increase especially our terrestrial orchids and get more diversity into the collection that way. So that's kind of where we're starting with the micro propagation. But it'll be very exciting when we start beginning orchids from seed. We're going to have to be patient. It can take many, many years for an orchid to bloom from seed to blooming time.
Light purple orchids in bloom. Bab nestles amidst orchids resembling a rainforest.
Those of you that grow orchids at home that have questions, you can always access the Kemper Center for Home Gardening. They have culture sheets. They're very knowledgeable about how to care for common orchids. And I also want to thank you all for coming with me today on this fun tour. It was fun for me to show you some of the fun, different things we have growing in our orchid collection.
Excellent. I hope that you all enjoyed that. That video, I enjoyed it. And it was not the first time I watched it, so I'm glad. Now I would like to officially introduce our guest, Carol Gravens. I didn't ask you if that is how you pronounce your last name.
That is how I pronounce it.
Okay, good. Carol Gravens became a St. Louis master gardener in 2001 after retiring from a professional career as a microbiologist. She's also a master naturalist, which I would like to ask her about shortly. As an advanced master gardener, she volunteers in many capacities, but her first plant love is orchids, and she grows about 300 of them in her home. Carol can be found every Thursday volunteering in the orchid greenhouses at the Missouri Botanical Garden, helping to care for the garden's extensive orchid collection. She also shares her love of orchids by speaking to various garden clubs and community groups. She completed a degree in horticulture in her retirement and is a former Master Gardener of the Year. And she is a past president of the Orchid Society of Greater St. Louis. Hi, Carol. Thank you for being
here. Hi, Megan. Hi, everyone.
So now we're just going to open it up for any questions that are out there about the video or about orchids or anything that Carol might know the answer to. And don't be shy, guys. If you want to just speak out with a question, you can.
Do any of you grow orchids? Go ahead.
I have an orchid that I got from the garden, and it's in a pot, but it doesn't get any bigger. Do I have to change its pot in order for it to, I mean, usually most plants grow bigger and then you change the pot, but.
Right. Well, it's, I don't know what kind of an orchid you have. Do you know what kind of orchid it is? There are many orchid genera. Ordinarily, we repot them about every 2 years. The medium, the orchid bark breaks down and becomes soggy, and then the roots will rot and the plant will die. So it's important to repot about every 2 years. Now, orchids, however, we like to say that they like tight shoes. So you never ever want to overpot an orchid. You want the pot to just accommodate the roots. And then you buy a orchid potting mix, which is usually has fir bark in it. It'll usually have some horticultural charcoal and maybe a little, I can't think of the name of it now, the white stuff, the perlite in it. And it will, that's for good drainage. So, because your orchid is probably an epiphytic orchid, so in nature, it would be growing on the branch or a trunk of a tree and hanging on there. It likes good drainage. So it's very important to have good drainage. And how long did you say you had your orchid?
I think I've had it about 3 years.
Oh, it's time to repot then, but don't overpot
Yeah.
it. Don't overpot it. And when you repot it, trim off the roots that aren't viable, the roots that are dead. Trim those off. You just want the nice plump viable roots, and then put it in a pot that just accommodates the roots.
Okay, so does it need to be a deep pot that's as deep as the root?
No, just look at your roots. Always repot for the roots. Never repot for the foliage of an orchid. Always repot for the roots. So you have to take it out of its pot, and you have to look at it and see what the roots look like, and so what size pot to use. And at the garden, we generally use clay pots. Most of the growers use plastic pots because, first of all, they're cheaper, and second of all, because they're sending these plants around the country. The plastic is much lighter than clay. So it's strictly what you prefer. But it must have good drainage. You have to have the holes in the bottom of the pot.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else?
Do all orchids have seed pods?
Well, they don't have seed pods unless they're pollinated. And at the garden, we generally don't want the orchids to be pollinated, except special ones. Babs was talking about the calanthe that they're working with now. So if an orchid is pollinated, and what's interesting about orchid pollination is it's like a lock and key. So the insect that pollinates the flower fits like a key into the anatomy of the orchid, and it's specific to that orchid. They evolved together over many, many, many thousands of years, and only that particular insect can pollinate that particular orchid. And orchids pack their pollen into what's called pollinia. And most orchid flowers have 2 pollinia, and they look like little yellow pinheads. Their pollen isn't powdery like a lily or a rose would be. It's packed into these 2 little pollinia. So then the insect goes inside of the flower. And of course, the insect has visited another flower before it comes to that one. And as it goes inside the flower, the pollen from its previous visitation is caught by the stigma, the female reproductive organ. And then as it leaves that flower, it picks up the pollen from that flower and goes on to the next. So it's really interesting. They're very interesting. The seeds of an orchid, if the orchid is pollinated and fertilized, the seed pod will begin to grow. It takes about 9 months to mature, and the flower will immediately die if it is pollinated, and then the seed pod will develop. And then the seed pod, after it is mature, and there are many, from the time it's mature, if it's a crop like an orchid she was talking, or like a vanilla orchid, where we want that seed pod to be used in our foods, it takes about 2 years till that is accomplished. So the seed pod matures on the plant, and then for vanilla, Then it is dried in the sun, and it is wrapped in wool blankets to be processed, to ferment. It's taken out of there and it's put in airtight metal containers to be processed. And each of those processes takes 6 to 9 months. So it takes about 2 years for a vanilla coming from the plant in order to be used as, to flavor our food. Now, each of those orchid seed pods produces millions of seeds, but they're only the size of dust particles. Orchid seeds are very, very tiny, so they have no nutrition of their own, like a bean seed would have, for example. So in order for that seed to germinate, it has to fall on a specific mycorrhizal fungus, either on the tree, or if it's a epiphytic orchid, or on the ground if it's a terrestrial orchid. And that microscopic fungus has also evolved along with that orchid and along with a pollinator. So with orchids, we always say it takes 3 to tango. It doesn't take 2 to tango. You have to have the flower, you have to have the pollinator, and you have to have the fungus in order for that to germinate. Now, once that seed germinates and a little tiny plant is born, in order for that plant to mature and flower, it takes at least 7 years. So it does take a while for that to happen. So orchids are just absolutely fascinating, and there's a lot of history behind orchids, because many of the primitive cultures, use them in their ceremonies, and they're used in literature. I'm thinking of Nero Wolfe, for example, the detective in New York who grew orchids on his roof. He called them his concubines. Those are novels, of course, the books. And then I'm thinking of the art, how orchids are used in art. Particularly the Chinese used orchids very, very frequently, and still do in art. And the American artist Georgia O'Keeffe frequently painted orchids. So they've permeated a lot of cultures, and a lot of primitive cultures use them for cures, or in their ceremonies, like when they would, this is kind of gory, but when they would sacrifice their virgins, for example, they would smear these young girls with the juices of orchids. They were very involved in the ceremonies. So orchids are frequently involved with sex. They're considered to be involved with potency and fertility, especially with primitive cultures. And
is
go
that
ahead.
why years ago that I saw on Channel 9 they were talking about the botanical garden, and that they used to have they used to sell orchids, because that was something that was presented to a young lady on a first date, and you were really
It was presented at
considered
the.
a schmo if you weren't showing up with that orchid.
I can tell you're much younger than I am, because in my era, when you went to the prom in high school, and your date gave you an orchid, that was just the epitome, of having an orchid, either a big purple or white cattleya. And if you had a strapless formal, you had a wrist corsage. So yes, and the garden used to have its orchid collection out of what we call now Shaw Nature Reserve in Gray Summit, Missouri. They moved the orchids out there in the 1920s because there was so much smog and bad air here in the city that the orchids were all dying. So they moved them out there. And you're absolutely right. So what they did out there then, they did a lot of propagation, and they would sell cut orchids for the florist to make corsages. And I mean, it wasn't just the young girls who had the corsages, but if you were a mother, you always got a corsage for Mother's Day if you were really appreciated by your family. And you know, there were orchids that were specifically hybridized for the first ladies, the president's wives. And orchids were extremely popular as cut flowers. Now you're seeing a little of that in weddings again, where people have cut orchids in vases and on the tables at their weddings. But now it's kind of we don't have the corsages anymore. I guess that's considered too ostentatious. I don't know, but we all buy the plants now because of micro propagation. They've become very inexpensive, and we can go to Sam's, or we can go to Trader Joe's, or we can go to Schnucks or whatever, and we can probably buy an orchid for $12, $15, $20, and it's a beautiful orchid. And so we bring them into our homes, and that way we can appreciate them, you know, for months, because on many types of orchids, the flowers will last for months. So they're really a bargain when you think about it, even if you throw the plant away after the bloom is finished, because they last for months. And cut flowers, what do they last? A week, 10 days? If you get roses or what have you, for Mother's Day or any other occasion. So they're really lovely now. And micropropagation was actually discovered in the 1960s. And this is how they can produce all of these orchid plants so inexpensively. It used to be, well, the orchids first came to Europe in the 19th century when these explorers were going out, you know, around the world, and they would bring them back, and then the Europeans didn't know how to take care of them, but they would pay hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, equivalent today, for a single plant, and they didn't know how to take care of them. And when you think of orchids growing in the tropics on trees, you know, there's a lot of breezes up there and everything. Well, when they brought them back to England and the other countries of Europe, they put them in what they called stove houses, and they were greenhouses, but they didn't have any movement of air, and they heated them very, very hot. And then they wondered why they didn't last too long. And so, you know, it took a long time until we discovered all of these intricacies of orchids and learned how to reproduce them inexpensively. With micropropagation now, they just take a few cells from the new growth of the orchid and grow it in tissue culture. And, you know, that way the orchids that are produced are clones of the mother plant. So they know they have a beautiful plant. Now, obviously, there are some beautiful orchids, and there are some that maybe are a little homely. And if it takes 7 years to produce an orchid from seed, and of course seed is a sexual means of reproduction, and you don't know what the flower is going to look like because you have two parents, and it takes 7 years to see what the flower looks like, and it may be beautiful and it may be not so beautiful. Whereas if you can propagate them by micropropagation, you know that those little plants that you're producing are clones of the mother plant, and they're going to look exactly like the mother plant. So I've talked too much. Now, how about some more questions? Nobody has anything to contribute after all I've said?
This may be a very rookie question, if I may ask.
Oh,
I've only thank you.
Go
I've
ahead.
had very informational. I've had one orchid and it didn't last long at all. And I believe it's probably because I overwatered it. So how much water?
Okay, it's probably a drainage issue. And you know, if it was an orchid, a Phalaenopsis orchid, a moth orchid that you probably bought at these ones that are so popular now, frequently in order for those plants to grow faster, the growers will grow them in a moss. It's a long fibered moss from New Zealand, and they'll grow very fast in that. But you're absolutely right. If you keep it in that moss, it retains too much water. And if you are putting water on all the time and don't have good drainage, that's another thing. Sometimes when you buy orchids, they'll be in a pot with no drainage. And you know, it's very elementary to think that if something is meant to have good drainage and it's in water all the time, those roots aren't going to get oxygen and they're going to rot. So if your orchid is, you buy an orchid and it is in that moss, that long fibered sphagnum moss, after it blooms, cut off the flower spike, take it out of that pot, and put it in you can buy a bag of orchid bark at your greenhouse or at Lowe's or what have you, and repot it in there. And when it's in that bark mixture and it has holes in the pot, it has very good drainage. So that was your problem. That was your problem. Anyone else have any questions?
I have a question.
Okay, Megan.
In your bio, it says that you have about 300 orchids in your house.
I do. Okay, shall I tell you about them?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you know, I dabbled in orchids a little bit before I retired, but I had a kind of a responsible position and I traveled a lot, both domestically and internationally, because I worked for a French company the last 18 years. And I had a few orchids, but after I retired, you know, I had time on my hands and I loved them. And I always loved plants. And as you read in my bio, I became a master gardener. And I always wanted to get into orchids because one of the bosses I had was an orchid judge, and he was from Australia. And he got me very interested in them. And so I started collecting orchids. And now, where am I going to put them? You know, I live in a house. I do not have a greenhouse for my orchids. You know, a lot of people, a lot of the growers, my friends, have greenhouses. I do not have a greenhouse. I have a koi pond, but I do not have a greenhouse. So we have an old house, and it has a basement, which is kind of basement-y. And my husband built some tables out of 2x4s in the basement, and you put like hardware cloth on the top there, and then you buy lights, and they have to be full spectrum because you have to simulate the sun, so you have to have the full spectrum lights. And about 2 or 3 years ago, we changed everything to LED lights because it's a lot cheaper to run them. I also have a sunroom in my home on the first floor with an east exposure, which is the best exposure for orchids. So I put the bloomers in my sunroom where I live and can enjoy them all the time. And, you know, most orchids are winter bloomers, not all of them, but the greater majority are winter bloomers. So I have at any given time between, I would say, 30 and 50 out there in my sunroom blooming. Now, what I do in the summer, I take them outside. So on the side of my house, it's shaded. There are trees there. And my husband made me racks out of copper plumbing. And you can buy hangers for the pots. They fit over the lip of the pot. And I put most of my orchids outside in the summer. They go out about the 1st of June and they come back in about the end of September. You have to look at your nighttime temperatures, and they can't be below about 55 degrees. So that's where I have my orchids.
That's amazing. I'm just thinking of how many that would be. Erica, you have a question?
Yeah, I would just like to ask, I was just curious about those orchids that actually emit a deep fragrance in the dark. Where would be the best place to put those within a house?
You just like any place, any other orchid, and most orchids like east exposure to the best. Use anything but north. If west and south get too bright in the summer, you know, it can sunburn some of them. We have orchids, as Bab said, who like different temperatures, but we also have orchids that like different light exposures. And they'll sunburn, most of them, fairly easily. So if you do put them outside, you want them in a shade or a dappled shade. But you know, you can as far as the fragrance goes, it's very interesting because they'll produce the fragrance at the time that their pollinator is active. And remember, Babs told you that Brassivola nodosa, the lady of the night, is pollinated by a moth. Now think of it. When are moths active? Only at night. So it only has to produce that fragrance to attract its pollinator at night. During the day, why waste the energy of making a fragrance when your pollinator isn't going to be there? So that's why orchids are, if it's pollinated, let's say by a butterfly, it would be fragrant during the day because butterflies are active during the day. So the flower, if it is fragrant at all, is going to be fragrant when its specific pollinator is active. And these insects are usually only active at a certain time of the day. So that's anything else? Did I explain it fully for you, or do you have another question?
No, you explained it
I
well.
have
Thank
another
you.
question.
You're welcome.
I have another question. If you put them outside, do bugs eat them, or do you have to do something to keep bugs from eating them, or do they not bother?
No,
them?
you know, I don't put the ones that flower outside because I want to enjoy them. So they keep them inside in my sunroom because that's where I sit the most. But if you put them outside, it usually isn't a problem. It usually isn't a problem. Now, sometimes they can get slugs, you know, those they look like snails without shells on, and they will crawl up and eat on them sometimes, but generally not. Now I do, before I bring them in the fall, I do spray them with some horticultural oil, some light horticultural oil, in order to kill anything that might be on them. But I haven't had a problem at all with insects eating them outside. They're hanging, remember, they're not on the ground. They're hanging on racks. They're, you know, in the air. Now, you know what? It's interesting because I keep tags, a little plastic, you know, tag in each plant, and there's a whole history on that tag. When I inquired it, or, you know, from whom, how I, when I repotted it, when it bloomed, etc. So, and I've had trouble with squirrels coming and eating my plastic tags sometimes. So I try to put 2 in every plant. And if the squirrel gets one, I still have one with the history on it of that plant.
Great. Well, we're at 6:47 right now. Does anybody have any last questions before we let Carol go? Nope. Well, I just want to thank you, Carol, for.
Well, I want to thank you because I enjoy doing these programs. I have never done a program for your group, obviously, before, but I love being with people, and I love sharing my what I know about orchids because, you know, I'll tell you one thing they say about orchids. If someone gives you an orchid, a gift of an orchid plant, and you don't want to become an addict like I am, you better give it away to someone else by 5 o'clock that day.
You fall in love.
Right. And you become an orchid addict too. But what a great addiction, huh?
You know, I always think of orchids. I watch a lot of like murder mystery shows, and like
Yes.
every long running murder mystery show has an episode with an orchid, like Midsummer Murders, Murder She Wrote.
Yes.
Every
Yes.
one of those shows have
Yes. Yes.
something where something very dramatic happens, and it's all
Well, you know that in mythology, and you go back to the primitive cultures, there's some very gory things, a very history about orchids, and so I guess they kind of make that connection with a mystery show, to have that bringing in the primitive cultures.
yeah. And I think that too. I always imagined, and maybe it's probably from these shows that were older, that orchids were just very expensive and that people did not
Well, they
have orchids
were.
in their house.
They
Well, yeah,
were.
it's so interesting to learn that now I can just go to the store and buy one.
Yes. You couldn't do that 25 years ago, my dear.
Which is all these shows that I'm watching are probably that old. So that's probably part of the problem. So, well, great. Well, thank you for coming. We're so glad to have you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
And
It was nice meeting all of you.
yes, and next week, for anyone that's interested, I hope everybody comes back next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. We will be learning about Teahouse Island. At the
Ooh, that's very exciting too.
Yes, and that is also a behind the scenes tour. So we
Yes,
get to learn
everybody
about
doesn't
things.
get to the Teahouse.
Yes,
I've been there. I've been there twice. I've been a volunteer at the garden for 20 years, and I've been there twice.
Oh, and we get up close and personal with the tea house.
Oh yes, yes.
So
you get to crawl in the. You get to
Yes.
crawl in the tea. Yes, I have
Yes.
crawled in the Teahouse.
It's very interesting. So, you know, that's what's going to happen next week. So everybody tune in. And so I guess with that, we will say good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks for coming.
Good
Bye.
night,
Good night.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.